In March 2009, the body of 65-year-old Evelyn Mallister was found in a bloodied honeymoon suite at the luxurious Coral Palms Resort in Nassau, Bahamas. An investigation uncovered the shocking history of her whirlwind relationship with 67-year-old Vietnam veteran Gerald Mallister. In September 2008, at a veterans fundraiser in Atlanta, Georgia, a series of events began that would ultimately lead to a devastating tragedy. On the peaceful morning of March 7, 2009, the Coral Palms Resort, known for its serene beaches and world-class luxury, became the epicenter of a nightmare no one could have imagined. Guests in their suites were starting their day, some enjoying breakfast on balconies overlooking the turquoise ocean, while others prepared for excursions. But on the fifth floor of the resort, a disturbing discovery turned the day into chaos. Evelyn Mallister, a 65-year-old woman who had arrived just days earlier with her new husband Gerald, was found dead in the honeymoon suite. The scene in the room was devastating. Evelyn's body lay on the cold marble floor, a still figure surrounded by dark, drying blood. The injuries on her body told a story of pain and violence. Her face was swollen and bruised, and deep lacerations marked her arms and torso. Her hands showed defensive wounds, a silent testament to her desperate attempts to protect herself. Around her, the suite was in complete disarray. Furniture was overturned, shards of glass glittered on the floor, and blood splatters stained the cream-colored walls. A once celebratory champagne bottle, now broken, lay near her body. Its jagged edge suggested it had been used as a weapon. The horror of the discovery spread quickly through the resort. The housekeeper, who stumbled upon the scene after noticing the "Do Not Disturb" sign had been hanging on the door for too long, was the first to alert security. Her screams echoed through the hallway as she ran for help, her hands trembling as she tried to explain what she had seen. Within minutes, resort security notified the Nassau police, who arrived promptly to secure the area and begin their investigation. In stark contrast to the chaos inside, Gerald Mallister, Evelyn's 67-year-old husband, was found sitting silently on the balcony of the suite. He was dressed in a wrinkled shirt stained with what appeared to be blood, and his hands rested on the armrests of the chair, bruised and bloodied. His expression was vacant, as though he had retreated into some hidden part of his mind. Officers approached him cautiously, noting the strong smell of alcohol emanating from him. When they began to question him, he seemed disoriented, offering only vague and fragmented responses. He muttered about things not going as planned but offered no clear explanation of what had transpired in the room. The investigation quickly began to take shape. Forensic officers meticulously combed through the scene, photographing every detail, collecting evidence, and documenting the physical destruction in the room. The broken champagne bottle was carefully bagged, the blood patterns analyzed, and every item in the room, from the shattered glass to the rumpled bedding, was scrutinized for clues. As investigators pieced together the events of the night, they began to form a chilling picture of what might have occurred. Over the next few hours, police interviewed staff and guests at the resort. Several guests on the same floor reported hearing loud voices coming from the Mallister suite late on the night of March 6, 2009. Some described hearing the muffled sounds of an argument, followed by loud crashes that sounded like furniture being thrown. One guest staying in the suite directly next to the Mallisters recounted hearing Evelyn's voice raised in anger, followed by a chilling scream that seemed to echo down the hallway. The guest said it was impossible to make out specific words, but one phrase stood out clearly in the midst of the chaos: "You lied to me." The sounds abruptly stopped a short while later, leaving an eerie silence. As police began interviewing Gerald more formally on March 8, 2009, his responses raised even more questions. Gerald claimed to have no memory of the events leading up to Evelyn's death. He told investigators that he had been drinking heavily the night before, a claim supported by the empty bottles of rum and whiskey found in the room. While his apparent intoxication might have clouded his recollection, the physical evidence seemed to tell a different story. His knuckles were raw and bruised, consistent with the type of injuries sustained during a physical altercation. Cuts on his hands suggested he might have been involved in the violent struggle that had left the room in shambles. Yet, Gerald offered no explanation for these injuries, his only statement being that he woke up on the balcony with no memory of what had happened before. As the investigation deepened, detectives began uncovering troubling aspects of the Mallisters' relationship. Gerald, a retired Marine with a decorated military career, had a history of anger issues, often attributed to post-traumatic stress disorder from his time in Vietnam. While there were no known reports of violence in his past relationships, His temperament had been described by acquaintances as unpredictable. Evelyn, on the other hand, was known as a gentle and caring woman who had spent her life as a school teacher before retiring. Friends described her as someone who sought love and companionship but had been cautious about remarrying after losing her first husband to illness. One detail that stood out to investigators was a recent financial decision made by Evelyn. Just weeks before the wedding, Evelyn had transferred a significant sum of money to a joint account she shared with Gerald. Friends later revealed that Evelyn had expressed concerns about Gerald's financial stability but had ultimately trusted him, believing their marriage would be a fresh start. This detail added a possible motive to the case, raising the question of whether money had played a role in the events leading to her death. As police pieced together the timeline, more questions arose than answers. What had sparked the argument that guests overheard? Why had Evelyn screamed those haunting words, "You lied to me"? And most importantly, what role had Gerald's past and the couple's seemingly fragile trust played in the violent tragedy that unfolded in their suite? By March 20, 2009, the evidence collected was compelling enough for police to charge Gerald Malister with murder. The case that had begun as a romantic honeymoon in paradise had turned into a shocking tale of betrayal, violence, and loss. Investigators knew there was still much to uncover, but the chilling details already revealed painted a heartbreaking portrait of a marriage that ended in an unspeakable tragedy. 6 months before the tragedy that unfolded in the Bahamas, life seemed to offer a new beginning for Evelyn Malister, a 65-year-old retired school teacher from Savannah, Georgia. Evelyn was the epitome of warmth and resilience. She had spent her years nurturing young minds and caring for her ailing husband, who passed away a few years earlier after a long battle with cancer. Though she appeared composed, Evelyn had quietly battled loneliness since his death, longing for companionship and love. That longing was what eventually led her to attend a veterans fundraiser in late September 2008 in Atlanta, Georgia. It was at this event, held in a grand ballroom adorned with American flags and military memorabilia, that Evelyn first met Gerald Malister. He stood out among the crowd, a tall, rugged man with a weathered face that seemed to tell stories of bravery and hardship. Gerald was a 67-year-old Vietnam War veteran, a retired Marine who carried himself with an air of authority. Guests at the fundraiser were captivated by his stories of combat and heroism, which he recounted with a mixture of pride and melancholy. Evelyn found herself drawn to his presence, feeling a spark of excitement she hadn't experienced in years. What began as polite conversation that evening quickly blossomed into a whirlwind romance. Evelyn was enchanted by Gerald's attention and charm. He praised her kindness, admired her strength, and made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt since losing her husband. Within weeks, Gerald began visiting Evelyn in Savannah, often bringing flowers and sharing evenings filled with laughter and shared dreams. Evelyn's friends and family noticed a change in her. She seemed livelier and more optimistic about the future. To them, it appeared that Gerald had filled a void in her life. But even as their relationship deepened, subtle red flags began to surface. Gerald spoke little about his life before meeting Evelyn. Aside from his military service, he had no close friends or family that he introduced to her. When Evelyn gently probed about his past relationships, Gerald was vague, brushing off the topic with jokes or changes in subject. These moments unsettled Evelyn, but she dismissed them, convincing herself that Gerald's reticence was a result of his military experiences. By December 2008, just 3 months after they met, Gerald proposed to Evelyn. Though surprised by the speed of his proposal, Evelyn accepted. She confided to her younger sister Margaret that she believed fate had brought Gerald into her life. "It's like my second chance," she had said. But Margaret, who had always been protective of her sister, was less convinced. She voiced concerns about Gerald's temper, which she had glimpsed at a family gathering when he reacted angrily to a harmless joke. Evelyn, however, brushed aside her sister's worries, attributing Gerald's reaction to his war scars. As the wedding date approached, Evelyn began noticing cracks in the perfect image she had built around Gerald. In mid-January 2009, while helping Gerald organize his belongings in preparation for their move into her Savannah home, Evelyn stumbled upon something that made her heart sink. On an old laptop Gerald had left open, she found a series of emails exchanged between him and a younger woman named Angela. The tone of the messages was flirtatious, hinting at an intimacy that made Evelyn feel physically ill. Though the emails were dated several months before they met, Evelyn couldn't shake the sense of betrayal. She confronted Gerald that evening, hoping for an honest explanation. Gerald dismissed her concerns, insisting that Angela was just a fling from his past. He reassured her that the relationship had ended long before he met her, claiming he was now fully committed to their future together. Though Gerald's words seemed sincere, Evelyn was left with lingering doubts. She confided in her best friend Maria during a coffee date on February 1, 2009. Evelyn admitted that while she still loved Gerald, she was beginning to question how well she truly knew him. Maria, ever the realist, advised Evelyn to slow down and think carefully before moving forward with the marriage. But Evelyn, caught between her heart and her intuition, chose to move forward, hoping that her fears were unfounded. By early February 2009, another troubling revelation emerged. Gerald had approached Evelyn about co-signing a loan to help him pay off what he described as lingering debts from his post-military life. Gerald framed it as a necessary step to start their life together without financial burdens. Though hesitant, Evelyn eventually agreed. Her late husband's careful financial planning had left her in a secure position, and she wanted to support Gerald. She signed the paperwork, transferring a significant portion of her savings into a joint account they opened together. Gerald thanked her profusely, promising to repay her trust with unwavering devotion. However, friends noticed a change in Evelyn's demeanor after the financial arrangement. She seemed more subdued, as if weighed down by an invisible burden. Maria later recounted that Evelyn had expressed concerns about Gerald's spending habits, which she discovered were more reckless than she had anticipated. She also worried that Gerald's stories of financial hardship didn't entirely add up. Still, Evelyn reassured herself that every relationship required compromise and trust. As the weeks leading up to their honeymoon unfolded, Evelyn tried to focus on the positives. She threw herself into planning their trip to the Bahamas, choosing the Coral Palms resort for its reputation as a romantic getaway. Evelyn even remarked to Margaret during a phone call on February 28, 2009, just days before the wedding, that this trip would be their chance to truly connect. "Once we're away from the stress, we'll remember why we fell in love," she said with a hopeful tone. But beneath Evelyn's optimism was an undercurrent of doubt. The flirtatious emails, Gerald's secrecy about his past, and the unease surrounding their financial arrangements gnawed at the edges of her happiness. As she packed her suitcase for the honeymoon, Evelyn included a leather-bound journal, a habit she had maintained for decades to document her thoughts. She planned to use the quiet moments on the island to reflect and find clarity. What Evelyn couldn't have foreseen was that these small troubling signs, those ignored instincts, and uneasy feelings would culminate in a storm of betrayal and violence that would shatter her world forever. The night of March 6, 2009, began like any other romantic evening at the Coral Palms resort. The air was warm, the ocean breeze carrying the soft hum of laughter and music from the resort's outdoor restaurant. The couple had reserved a table near the water, a spot that many considered the best for enjoying the moonlit sea. Evelyn, dressed in a light floral dress, looked radiant, though her friends would later recount that she had seemed quieter in the days leading up to their trip. Gerald, in a crisp linen shirt, sat opposite her, his broad shoulders stiff and his eyes avoiding hers. The tension between them was subtle at first. Their waiter, who had served dozens of honeymooning couples that week, noticed that they weren't engaging in the usual affectionate banter seen among newlyweds. Instead, Evelyn appeared withdrawn, occasionally glancing at her plate, while Gerald seemed focused on his drink. Other diners nearby later remarked that their table seemed unnaturally silent, the kind of quiet that spoke volumes about unspoken arguments. Midway through the meal, something changed. The hushed tension at their table erupted, drawing the attention of those seated nearby. While no one could hear every word exchanged, it was clear from Evelyn's expressive gestures and Gerald's curt, restrained responses that the argument had escalated. The waiter, who was refilling water glasses nearby, later recalled Evelyn's pained expression as she leaned forward, her voice trembling. Whatever she said struck a nerve in Gerald, who visibly stiffened, his jaw tightening. Moments later, Evelyn abruptly stood, her chair scraping loudly against the stone floor, and left the restaurant. Gerald remained seated for a while, staring at his drink before rising slowly and heading toward the bar. Evelyn's sudden exit didn't go unnoticed. She walked briskly through the resort's dimly lit pathways, her hands clenched at her sides. A guest lounging near the pool saw her sitting alone on a bench a few minutes later, her face buried in her hands. The guest debated whether to approach her but decided against it, assuming she might want privacy. Evelyn eventually returned to their suite sometime after midnight, seen on security footage walking through the hallways with an unsteady step. Her head was bowed, and she clutched her purse tightly as though shielding herself from the world. By this time, Gerald had been at the bar for over an hour. Resort staff noticed he was drinking heavily, ordering multiple rounds of whiskey with little conversation. Some observed his demeanor shifting from brooding silence to visible frustration, muttering to himself as he stared into his glass. At one point, the bartender offered to call someone for him, concerned about his state, but Gerald declined. Just before 2 a.m. on March 7, 2009, security footage captured him walking back toward their suite. He moved slowly at first, but as he approached the hallway leading to their room, his pace quickened. He hesitated outside the door, pacing back and forth for several minutes. His body language, captured on camera, suggested he was agitated, running his hands through his hair and clenching his fists. What happened inside the suite after Gerald entered remains a matter of piecing together evidence and eyewitness accounts. Neighbors on either side of the Mallisters' room described hearing muffled voices growing louder as the minutes passed. Evelyn's voice, which had started calm but strained, became desperate. She sounded cornered, pleading, though her words were difficult to make out. Gerald's voice, lower and more forceful, dominated the argument. Around 2:30 a.m., the shouting was punctuated by the sound of something heavy hitting the wall, followed by loud crashes that shook the quiet hallway. At least one neighbor considered calling hotel security but hesitated, assuming it was a typical lovers' quarrel. The noise subsided briefly, only to be broken by a scream that sent chills through those who heard it. The sound was sharp and piercing, cutting through the stillness of the night. A neighboring guest described it as the kind of scream that made her freeze in place. Moments later, silence fell, thick and unsettling. The next part of the timeline was revealed through forensic evidence and the suite's physical state. Evelyn had tried to defend herself, as indicated by the cuts on her hands and arms. The struggle moved across the room, overturning furniture and breaking glass. A champagne bottle, previously placed on a table as part of the resort's honeymoon package, had been shattered, likely during the altercation. Blood patterns on the walls and floors suggested Evelyn had fallen more than once, struggling to get up before being struck again. The suite's once pristine luxury had become a scene of chaos and violence. Security footage showed no one leaving or entering the room after Gerald returned. By the time hotel staff discovered Evelyn's lifeless body on the morning of March 7, it was clear the events of the previous night had spiraled into tragedy. Gerald, found on the balcony, had bloodied knuckles consistent with physical assault. His dazed state and the strong smell of alcohol suggested he had been drinking heavily before and after the incident. When questioned by the police, his responses were fragmented and evasive. He admitted to an argument but claimed to have no memory of what followed. Investigators believe the events of that night were fueled by a volatile mix of Gerald's insecurities, Evelyn's confrontation about his infidelity and finances, and the alcohol that dulled any semblance of self-control Gerald may have had. The emotional weight of the evening, compounded by the couple's fraught history, reached its breaking point in those early hours, leaving Evelyn to bear the ultimate cost of Gerald's anger and deception. By the time dawn broke over the Coral Palms resort, the honeymoon suite had become a crime scene. What had started as a romantic getaway had turned into a devastating tale of betrayal and violence. The memories of that night would linger long after the investigators left, and the resort resumed its usual calm, haunting those who witnessed the unraveling of a love story that had gone so horribly wrong. The verdict came on December 14, 2009. After 3 agonizing weeks of gut-wrenching testimony, the courtroom was a microcosm of grief, curiosity, and outrage. It was packed to the brim with reporters eager for the next shocking detail, spectators drawn by morbid fascination, and Evelyn's grieving family, who bore the unbearable weight of their loss. Every day had been a trial of its own, as the jury listened to the gruesome details of the crime, pored over harrowing evidence, and heard the heartbreaking accounts of Evelyn's vibrant life, only to see it end in unimaginable tragedy. When the jury filed back into the room on that fateful day, the tension in the air was palpable, suffocating even. No one moved as the foreman rose to deliver their decision. Guilty of second-degree murder. The words rang out, a mix of relief and sorrow washing over the room. The prosecution had succeeded in proving Gerald Mallister's culpability, yet the weight of Evelyn's absence remained an unfillable void. The sentence followed shortly after, life in prison without the possibility of parole. For many, it was justice. For Evelyn's family, it was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but no verdict could bring her back. Margaret, Evelyn's older sister, sat in the front row, clutching a worn photograph of Evelyn. Her fingers trembled, as though holding on to her sister's memory was the only thing keeping her upright. When the sentence was announced, Margaret's quiet sobs echoed softly in the courtroom. Her tears weren't those of victory, but of a heart mourning the kind-hearted woman she had lost. Evelyn had been more than a sister, she had been a confidant, a nurturer, and a light in their family's lives. That light had been extinguished far too soon, leaving a darkness that no prison sentence could illuminate. The trial had ripped away Gerald Mallister's carefully crafted facade, exposing a man far removed from the charming, charismatic persona he projected. Witness after witness described his manipulative tendencies, his smoldering insecurities, and the financial woes that gnawed at his self-worth. They painted the portrait of a man who had allowed his desperation to metastasize into deceit and violence. Gerald had seen Evelyn not as a partner to cherish, but as a means to an end, a lifeline to bolster his fragile ego and crumbling world. The prosecution argued persuasively that Gerald had exploited Evelyn's kind heart, warming his way into her trust until she uncovered the truth of his lies. That confrontation, fueled by his drunken rage, became the flashpoint of her murder. Yet, even as the trial exposed Gerald's monstrous actions, Evelyn's life shone in stark contrast. She had been a nurturing presence in the world, a beloved teacher who spent her days shaping young minds, a devoted wife who had found love with her first husband, and a widow who refused to let grief harden her heart. When she met Gerald, she had been hopeful, ready to embrace love again. But as her journal revealed, Evelyn's optimism was tempered by doubt. She had written about her growing unease, the cracks in Gerald's charm that left her second-guessing her choices. But true to her forgiving nature, she had set those fears aside, clinging to the hope that love and patience might heal Gerald's flaws. Tragically, her kindness became the very thing he exploited, and her faith in him proved fatal. The trial left the community grappling with haunting questions. Could Evelyn's murder have been prevented? Should she have trusted her instincts and walked away when the red flags appeared? And what of Gerald? What might have happened if he had sought help for his unresolved trauma and unchecked anger? Those who had known Gerald as a decorated veteran and respected member of the community were left in stunned disbelief, struggling to reconcile the man they once admired with the monster unmasked in court. His fall from grace served as a sobering reminder of how untreated emotional wounds, buried insecurities, and unacknowledged rage could spiral into catastrophic violence. As Gerald was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his face void of emotion, Evelyn's family was left to confront the wreckage of their lives. Their journey toward healing would be long and fraught with sorrow. In the weeks and months that followed, Evelyn's story became a cautionary tale. Her death underscored the dangers of ignoring one's instincts and the devastating consequences of misplaced trust. For those who loved her, Evelyn was not just a victim, but a beacon, a reminder of the strength and resilience of the human spirit and the fragility of life when trust is shattered. And yet, even in their grief, Evelyn's family resolved to keep her memory alive, not as a symbol of tragedy, but as a testament to a life lived with love, generosity, and courage, a legacy Gerald Mallister could never destroy.